3. Nakedness, the unaccommodated man. Now that we have seen Marx's melting vision in action, I want to use it to explicate some of the manifesto's most powerful images of modern life. In the passage below, Marx is trying to show how capitalism has transformed people's relationships with each other and with themselves. Although, in Marx's syntax, the bourgeoisie is the subject, in its economic activities that bring the big changes about, modern men and women of every class are objects, for all are changed. The bourgeoisie has torn apart the many feudal ties that bound men to their natural superiors, and left no other bond between man and man than naked interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the heavenly ecstasies of pious fanaticism, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism. In the icy water of egoistical calculation, the bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil, and turned the family relation into a pure money relation. In place of exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has put open, shameless, direct, naked exploitation. Marx's basic opposition here is between what is open or naked and what is hidden, veiled, clothed. This polarity, perennial in Eastern as well as Western thought, symbolizes everywhere a distinction between a real world and an illusory one. In most ancient and medieval speculative thought, the whole world of sensuous experience appears illusory, the Hindu veil of Maya, and the true world is thought to be accessible only through transcendence of bodies, space, and time. In some traditions, reality is accessible through religious or philosophical meditation. In others, it will be available to us only in a future existence after death. The Pauline, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face." The modern transformation, beginning in the age of the Renaissance and Reformation, places both these worlds on earth, in space and time, filled with human beings. Now the false world is seen as a historical past, a world we have lost, or in the process of losing, while the true world is in the physical and social world that exists for us here and now, or is in the process of coming into being. At this point, a new symbolism emerges. Clothes become an emblem of the old illusory mode of life. Nakedness comes to signify the newly discovered and experienced truth, and the act of taking off one's clothes becomes an act of spiritual liberation, of becoming real. Modern erotic poetry elaborates this theme, as generations of modern lovers have experienced it, with playful irony. Modern tragedy penetrates its awesome and fearsome depths. Marx thinks and works in the tragic tradition. For him, the clothes are ripped off, the veils are torn away, the stripping process is violent and brutal, and yet somehow the tragic moment of modern history is supposed to culminate in a happy end. The dialectic of nakedness that culminates in Marx is defined at the very start of the modern age, in Shakespeare's King Lear. For Lear, the naked truth is what a man is forced to face when he has lost everything that other men can take away except life itself. We see his voracious family, aided by his own blind vanity, tear away its sentimental veil. Stripped not only of political power, but of even the barest traces of human dignity, he is thrown out of doors in the middle of the night at the height of a torrential and terrifying storm. This, he says, is what human life comes down to in the end. The solitary and poor abandoned in the cold, while the nasty and brutish enjoy all the warmth that power can provide. Such knowledge seems to be too much for us. Man's nature cannot carry the affliction or the fear. But Lear is not broken by the storm's icy blasts. Neither does he flee them. Instead, he exposes himself to the storm's full fury, looks it in the face, and affirms himself against it, even as it tosses and tears him. As he wanders with his royal fool, Act 3, Scene 4, they meet Edgar, disguised as a crazy beggar, stark naked, apparently even more wretched than he. Is man no more than this? Lear demands. Thou art the thing itself, unaccommodated man. Now, at the climactic moment of the play, he tears off his royal robes. Off, off, you lendings, and joins poor Tom in naked authenticity. This act, which Lear believes has placed him at the very nadir of existence, a poor, bare, forked animal, turns out, ironically, to be his first step toward a full humanity, because for the first time he recognizes a connection between himself and another human being. This recognition enables him to grow in sensitivity and insight, and to move beyond the bounds of his self-absorbed bitterness and misery. As he stands and shivers, it dawns on him that his kingdom is full of people whose whole lives are consumed by the abandoned, defenseless suffering that he is going through right now. When he was in power, he never noticed, but now he stretches his vision to take them in. Poor naked wretches, wheresoever you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I obtain too little care of this. Take physic, pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens more just. It is only now that Lear is fit to be what he claims to be, every inch a king. His tragedy is that the catastrophe that redeems him humanly destroys him politically. The experience that makes him genuinely qualified to be a king makes it impossible for him to be one. His triumph lies in becoming something he never dreamt of being, a human being. Here, a hopeful dialectic lights up the tragic bleakness and blight. Alone in the cold and the wind and the rain, Lear develops the vision and courage to break out of his loneliness, to reach out to his fellow men for mutual warmth. Shakespeare is telling us that the dreadful naked reality of the unaccommodated man is the point from which accommodation must be made, the only ground on which real community can grow. In the 18th century, the metaphors of nakedness as truth and stripping as self-discovery take on a new political resonance. In Montesquieu's Persian letters, the veils that Persian women are forced to wear symbolize all the repressions that traditional social hierarchies inflict on people. By contrast, the absence of veils in the streets of Paris symbolizes a new kind of society, where liberty and equality reign, and where, as a consequence, everything speaks out, everything is visible, everything is audible. The heart shows itself as clearly as the face. Rousseau, in his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, denounces the uniform and deceptive veil of politeness that covers his age, and says that the good man is an athlete who loves to wrestle stark naked. He despises all those vile ornaments that cramp the use of his powers. Thus the naked man will be not only a freer and happier man, but a better man. The liberal revolutionary movements that bring the 18th century to a climax act out this faith. If hereditary privileges and social roles are stripped away, so that all men can enjoy an unfettered freedom to use all their powers, they will use them for the good of all mankind. We find here a striking absence of worry as to what the naked human being will do or be. The dialectical complexity and wholeness that we found in Shakespeare have faded away, and narrow polarizations have taken their place. The counter-revolutionary thought of this period shows the same narrowing and flattening of perspective. Here is Burke on the French Revolution. But now all is to be changed. All the pleasing illusions that made power gentle and obedience liberal, which harmonized the different shades of life, are to be dissolved by this new conquering empire of light and reason. All the decent drapery of life is to be rudely torn off. All the superadded ideas which the heart owns and the understanding ratifies, as necessary to cover the defects of our weak and shivering nature, and to raise it to a dignity in our own estimation, are to be exploded as a ridiculous, absurd, and antiquated fashion. The philosophes imagine nakedness as idyllic, opening new vistas of beauty and happiness for all. For Burke, it is counter-idyllic, an unmitigated disaster, a fall into nothingness from which nothing and no one can rise. Burke cannot imagine that modern men might learn something, as Lear learns, from their mutual vulnerability in the cold. Their only hope lies, in their capacity to construct mythic draperies heavy enough to stifle their dreadful knowledge of who they are. For Marx, writing in the aftermath of bourgeois revolutions and reactions, and looking forward to a new wave, the symbols of nakedness and unveiling regain the dialectical depth that Shakespeare gave them 2 centuries before. The bourgeois revolutions, in tearing away veils of religious and political illusion, have left naked power and exploitation, cruelty and misery, exposed like open wounds. At the same time, they have uncovered and exposed new options and hopes. Unlike the common people of all ages who have been endlessly betrayed and broken by their devotion to their natural superiors, modern men, washed in the icy water of egoistical calculation, are free from deference to masters who destroy them, animated rather than numbed by the cold. Because they know how to think of, by, and for themselves, they will demand a clear account of what their bosses and rulers are doing for them and doing to them, and be ready to resist and rebel where they are getting nothing real in return. Marx's hope is that once the unaccommodated men of the working class are forced to face the real conditions of their lives and their relations with their fellow men, they will come together to overcome the cold that cuts through them all. Their union will generate the collective energy that can fuel a new communal life. One of the manifesto's primary aims is to point the way out of the cold, to nourish and focus the common yearning for communal warmth, because the workers can come through the affliction and the fear only by making contact with the self's deepest resources. They will be prepared to fight for collective recognition of the self's beauty and value. Their communism, when it comes, will appear as a kind of transparent garment, at once keeping its wearers warm and setting off their naked beauty, so that they can recognize themselves and each other in all their radiance. Here, as so often in Marx, the vision is dazzling, but the light flickers if we look hard. It isn't hard to imagine alternate endings to the dialectic of nakedness. Endings less beautiful than Marx's, but no less plausible. Modern men and women might well prefer the solitary pathos and grandeur of the Rousseauian unconditioned self, or the collective, customed comforts of the Burkean political masque, rather than the Marxian attempt to fuse the best of both. Indeed, the sort of individualism that scorns and fears connections with other people as threats to the self's integrity, and the sort of collectivism that seeks to submerge the self in a social role, may be more appealing than the Marxian synthesis, because they are intellectually and emotionally so much easier. There is a further problem that might keep the Marxian dialectic from even getting underway. Marx believes that the shocks and upheavals and catastrophes of life in bourgeois society enable moderns, by going through them, as Lear does, to discover who they really are. But if bourgeois society is as volatile as Marx thinks, how can its people ever settle on any real selves? With all the possibilities and necessities that bombard the self, and all the desperate drives that propel it, how can anyone define definitively which ones are essential and which merely incidental? The nature of the newly naked modern man may turn out to be just as elusive and mysterious as that of the old clothed one, maybe even more elusive, because there will no longer be any illusion of a real self underneath the masks. Thus, along with community and society, individuality itself may be melting into the modern air. 4. The Metamorphosis of Values. The problem of nihilism emerges again in Marx's next line. The bourgeoisie has resolved all personal honor and dignity into exchange value, and in place of all the freedoms that men have fought for, it has put one unprincipled freedom, free trade. The first point here is the immense power of the market in modern men's inner lives. They look to the price list for answers to questions not merely economic, but metaphysical, questions of what is worthwhile, what is honorable, even what is real. When Marx says that other values are resolved into exchange value, his point is that bourgeois society does not efface old structures of value, but subsumes them. Old modes of honor and dignity do not die. Instead, they get incorporated into the market, take on price tags, gain a new life as commodities. Thus, any imaginable mode of human conduct becomes morally permissible the moment it becomes economically possible, becomes valuable. Anything goes if it pays. This is what modern nihilism is all about. Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, and their 20th century successors will ascribe this predicament to science, rationalism, and the death of God. Marx would say that its basis is far more concrete and mundane. It is built into the banal everyday workings of the bourgeois economic order, an order that equates our human value with our market price. No more, no less. and that forces us to expand ourselves in pushing our price up as far as we can make it go. Marx is appalled by the destructive brutalities that bourgeois nihilism brings to life, but he believes that it has a hidden tendency to transcend itself. The source of this tendency is the paradoxically unprincipled principle of free trade. Marx believes that the bourgeois really believe in this principle, that is, in an incessant unrestricted flow of commodities in circulation, a continuous metamorphosis of market values. If, as he believes, the members of the bourgeoisie really do want a free market, they will have to enforce the freedom of new products to enter the market. This in turn means that any fully fledged bourgeois society must be a genuinely open society, not only economically, but politically and culturally as well, so that people will be free to shop around and seek the best deals, in ideas, associations, laws, and social policies, as well as in things. The unprincipled principle of free trade will force the bourgeoisie to grant even communists the basic right that all businessmen enjoy, the right to offer and promote and sell their goods to as many customers as they can attract. Thus, by virtue of what Marx calls free competition within the realm of knowledge, even the most subversive works and ideas, like the Manifesto itself, must be allowed to appear on the grounds that they may sell. Marx is confident that once the ideas of revolution and communism become accessible to the masses, they will sell. And communism, as a self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, will come into its own. Thus he can live with bourgeois nihilism in the long run, because he sees it as active and dynamic, what Nietzsche would call a nihilism of strength. Propelled by its nihilistic drives and energies, the bourgeoisie will open the political and cultural floodgates through which its revolutionary nemesis will flow. This dialectic presents several problems. The first concerns the bourgeoisie's commitment to the unprincipled principle of free trade, whether in economics, politics, or culture. In fact, in bourgeois history, this principle has generally been more honored in the breach than in the observance. The members of the bourgeoisie, especially the most powerful, have generally fought to restrict, manipulate, and control their markets. Indeed, much of their creative energy over the centuries has gone into arrangements for doing this. Chartered monopolies, holding companies, trusts, cartels, and conglomerates, protective tariffs, price fixing, open or hidden subsidies from the state, all accompanied by paeans in praise of the free market. Moreover, even among the few who really do believe in free exchange, there are fewer still who would extend free competition to ideas as well as things. Wilhelm von Humboldt, J.S. Mill, Justices Holmes and Brandeis, and Douglas and Black have been still small voices in bourgeois society, embattled and marginal at best. A more typical bourgeois pattern is to praise freedom when in opposition, and to repress it when in power. Here Marx may be in danger, a surprising danger for him, of getting carried away by what bourgeois ideologues say, and losing touch with what the men with money and power actually do. This is a serious problem, because if the members of the bourgeoisie really don't give a damn about freedom, then they will work to keep the societies they control closed against new ideas, and it will be harder than ever for communism to take root. Marx would say that their need for progress and innovation will force them to open up their societies even to ideas they dread, yet their ingenuity might avoid this through a truly insidious innovation, a consensus of mutually enforced mediocrity, designed to protect each individual bourgeois from the risks of competition, and bourgeois society as a whole from the risks of change. Another problem in Marx's dialectic of the free market is that it entails a strange collusion between bourgeois society and its most radical opponents. This society is driven by its unprincipled principle of free exchange to open itself to movements for radical change. The enemies of capitalism may enjoy a great deal of freedom to do their work, to read, write, speak, meet, organize, demonstrate, strike, elect, but their freedom to move transforms their movement into an enterprise, and they find themselves cast in the paradoxical role of merchants and promoters of revolution, which necessarily becomes a commodity like everything else. Marx does not seem to be disturbed by the ambiguities of this social role, maybe because he is sure that it will become obsolete before it can ossify, that the revolutionary enterprise will be put out of business by its rapid success. A century later, we can see how the business of promoting revolution is open to the same abuses and temptations, manipulative frauds and wishful self-deceptions as any other promotional line. Finally, our skeptical doubts about promoters' promises must lead us to question one of the primary promises in Marx's work: the promise that communism, while upholding and actually deepening the freedoms that capitalism has brought us, will free us from the horrors of bourgeois nihilism. If bourgeois society is really the maelstrom Marx thinks it is, how can he expect all its currents to flow only one way, toward peaceful harmony and integration? Even if a triumphant communism should someday flow through the floodgates that free trade opens up, who knows what dreadful impulses might flow in along with it, or in its wake, or impacted inside. It is easy to imagine how a society committed to the free development of each and all might develop its own distinctive varieties of nihilism. Indeed, a communist nihilism might turn out to be far more explosive and disintegrative than its bourgeois precursor, though also more daring and original, because, while capitalism cuts the infinite possibilities of modern life with the limits of the bottom line, Marx's communism might launch the liberated self into immense unknown human spaces, with no limits at all. 5. The loss of a halo. All the ambiguities in Marx's thought are crystallized in one of his most luminous images, the last one we will explore here. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every activity hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has transformed the doctor, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science, into paid wage laborers. The halo, for Marx, is a primary symbol of religious experience, the experience of something holy. For Marx, as for his contemporary Kierkegaard, experience, rather than belief or dogma or theology, forms the core of religious life. The halo splits life into sacred and profane. It creates an aura of holy dread and radiance around the figure who wears it. The sanctified figure is torn from the matrix of the human condition, split off inexorably from the needs and pressures that animate the men and women who surround it. Marx believes that capitalism tends to destroy this mode of experience for everybody. All that is holy is profaned. Nothing is sacred. No one is untouchable. Life becomes thoroughly desanctified. In some ways, Marx knows this is frightful. Modern men and women may well stop at nothing, with no dread to hold them back, free from fear and trembling. They are free to trample down everyone in their way if self-interest drives them to it. But Marx also sees the virtue of a life without auras. It brings about a condition of spiritual equality. Thus, the modern bourgeoisie may hold vast material powers over the workers and everybody else, but it will never achieve the spiritual ascendancy that earlier ruling classes could take for granted. For the first time in history, all confront themselves and each other on a single plane of being. We must remember that Marx is writing at a historical moment when, especially in England and France, the manifesto really has more to do with them than with the Germany of Marx's time, disenchantment with capitalism is pervasive and intense, and almost ready to flare up in revolutionary forms. In the next 20 years or so, the bourgeoisie will prove remarkably inventive in constructing halos of its own. Marx will try to strip these away in the first volume of Capital, in his analysis of the fetishism of commodities, a mystique that disguises the intersubjective relations between men in a market society as purely physical, objective, unalterable relations between things. In the climate of 1848, this bourgeois pseudo-religiosity has not yet established itself. Marx's targets here are, for both him and us, a lot closer to home. Those professionals and intellectuals, the doctor, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science, who think they have the power to live on a higher plane than ordinary humanity, to transcend capitalism in life and work. Why does Marx place that halo on the heads of modern professionals and intellectuals in the first place? To bring out one of the paradoxes of their historical role. Even though they tend to pride themselves on their emancipated and thoroughly secular minds, they turn out to be just about the only moderns who really believe that they are called to their vocations and that their work is holy. It is obvious to any reader of Marx that in his commitment to his work he shares this faith, and yet he is suggesting here that in some sense it is a bad faith, a self-deception. This passage is so arresting because, as we see Marx identifying himself with the critical force and insight of the bourgeoisie, and reaching out to tear the halos from modern intellectuals' heads, we realize that in some sense it is his own head he is laying bare. The basic fact of life for these intellectuals, as Marx sees them, is that they are paid wage laborers of the bourgeoisie, members of the modern working class, the proletariat. They may deny this identity. After all, who wants to belong to the proletariat? But they are thrown into the working class by the historically defined conditions under which they are forced to work. When Marx describes intellectuals as wage earners, he is trying to make us see modern culture as part of modern industry. Art, physical science, social theory, like Marx's own, all are modes of production. The bourgeoisie controls the means of production in culture, as in everything else, and anyone who wants to create must work in the orbit of its power. Modern professionals, intellectuals, and artists, insofar as they are members of the proletariat, live only so long as they find work, and find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These workers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Thus they can write books, paint pictures, discover physical or historical laws, save lives, only if someone with capital will pay them. But the pressures of bourgeois society are such that no one will pay them unless it pays to pay them. That is, unless their work somehow help to increase capital. They must sell themselves piecemeal to an employer willing to exploit their brains for profit. They must scheme and hustle to present themselves in a maximally profitable light. They must compete, often brutally and unscrupulously, for the privilege of being bought, simply in order to go on with their work. Once the work is done, they are, like all other workers, separated from the products of their labor. Their goods and services go on sale, and it is the vicissitudes of competition, the fluctuations of the market, rather than any intrinsic truth or beauty or value, or for that matter any lack of truth or beauty or value, that will determine their fate. Marx does not expect that great ideas and works will fall stillborn for want of a market. The modern bourgeoisie is remarkably resourceful in wringing profit out of thought. What will happen instead is that creative processes and products will be used and transformed in ways that will dumbfound or horrify their creators. But the creators will be powerless to resist because they must sell their labor power in order to live. Intellectuals occupy a peculiar position in the working class, one that generates special privileges, but also special ironies. They are beneficiaries of the bourgeois demand for perpetual innovation, which vastly expands the market for their products and skills, often stimulates their creative audacity and imagination, and, if they are shrewd enough and lucky enough to exploit the need for brains, enables them to escape the chronic poverty in which most workers live. On the other hand, because they are personally involved in their work, unlike most wage laborers, who are alienated and indifferent, the fluctuations of the marketplace strike them in a far deeper way. In selling themselves piecemeal, they are selling not merely their physical energy, but their minds, their sensibilities, their deepest feelings, their visionary and imaginative powers, virtually the whole of themselves. Goethe's Faust gave us the archetype of a modern intellectual force to sell himself in order to make a difference in the world. Faust also embodied a complex of needs endemic to intellectuals. They are driven not only by a need to live, which they share with all men, but by a desire to communicate, to engage in dialogue with their fellow men. But the cultural commodity market offers the only media in which dialogue on a public scale can take place. No idea can reach or change moderns, unless it can be marketed and sold to them. Hence they turn out to be dependent on the market not for bread alone, but for spiritual sustenance, a sustenance they know the market cannot be counted on to provide. It is easy to see why modern intellectuals, trapped in these ambiguities, would imagine radical ways out. In their situation, revolutionary ideas would spring from the most direct and intense personal needs. But the social conditions that inspire their radicalism also serve to frustrate it. We saw that even the most subversive ideas must manifest themselves through the media of the market. Insofar as these ideas attract and arouse people, they will expand and enrich the market, and so increase capital. Now, if Marx's vision of bourgeois society is at all accurate, there is every reason to think that it will generate a market for radical ideas. This system requires constant revolutionizing, disturbance, agitation. It needs to be perpetually pushed and pressed in order to maintain its elasticity and resilience, to appropriate and assimilate new energies, to drive itself to new heights of activity and growth. This means, however, that men and movements that proclaim their enmity to capitalism, may be just the sort of stimulants capitalism needs. Bourgeois society, through its insatiable drive for destruction and development, and its need to satisfy the insatiable needs it creates, inevitably produces radical ideas and movements that aim to destroy it. But its very capacity for development enables it to negate its own inner negations, to nourish itself and thrive on opposition, to become stronger amid pressure and crisis than it could ever be in peace, to transform enmity into intimacy, and attackers into inadvertent allies. In this climate, then, radical intellectuals encounter radical obstacles. Their ideas and movements are in danger of melting into the same modern air that decomposes the bourgeois order they are working to overcome. To surround oneself with a halo in this climate is to try to destroy danger by denying it. The intellectuals of Marx's time were particularly susceptible to this sort of bad faith. Even as Marx was discovering socialism in the Paris of the 1840s, Gautier and Flaubert were developing their mystique of art for art's sake, while the circle around Auguste Comte was constructing its own parallel mystique of pure science. Both these groups, sometimes in conflict with each other, sometimes interfused, sanctified themselves as avant-gardes. They were at once perceptive and trenchant in their critiques of capitalism, and at the same time absurdly complacent in their faith that they had the power to transcend it, that they could live and work freely beyond its norms and demands. Marx's point in tearing the halos from their heads is that nobody in bourgeois society can be so pure or safe or free. The networks and ambiguities of the market are such that everybody is caught up and entangled in them. Intellectuals must recognize the depths of their own dependence, spiritual as well as economic dependence, on the bourgeois world they despise. It will never be possible to overcome these contradictions unless we confront them directly and openly. This is what stripping away the halos means. This image, like all the great images in the history of literature and thought, contains depths that its creator could not have foreseen. First of all, Marx's indictment of the 19th century artistic and scientific avant-gardes cuts just as deeply against the 20th century Leninist vanguards, who make an identical and equally groundless claim to transcend the vulgar world of need, interest, egoistical calculation, and brutal exploitation. Next, however, it raises questions about Marx's own romantic image of the working class. If being a paid wage laborer is the antithesis of having a halo, how can Marx speak of the proletariat as a class of new men, uniquely equipped to transcend the contradictions of modern life? Indeed, we can carry this questioning a step further. If we have followed Marx's unfolding vision of modernity and confronted all its endemic ironies and ambiguities, how can we expect anybody to transcend all this? Once again, we encounter a problem we have met before: the tension between Marx's critical insights and its radical hopes. My emphases in this essay have leaned toward the skeptical and self-critical undercurrents in Marx's thought. Some readers may be inclined to take only the criticism and self-criticism to heart and throw out the hopes as utopian and naive. To do this, however, would be to miss what Marx saw as the essential point of critical thinking. Criticism, as he understood it, was part of an ongoing dialectical process. It was meant to be dynamic, to drive and inspire the person criticized, to overcome both his critics and himself, to propel both parties toward a new synthesis. Thus, to unmask phony claims of transcendence is to demand and fight for real transcendence. To give up the quest for transcendence is to erect a halo around one's own stagnation and resignation, and to betray not only Marx, but ourselves. We need to strive for the precarious dynamic balance that Antonio Gramsci, one of the great communist writers and leaders of our century, described as pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Conclusion: culture and the contradictions of capitalism. I have been trying in this essay to define a space in which Marxist thought and the modernist tradition converge. First of all, both are attempts to evoke and to grasp a distinctively modern experience. Both confront this realm with mixed emotions, awe and elation, fused with a sense of horror. Both see modern life as shot through with contradictory impulsions and potentialities, and both embrace a vision of ultimate or ultra-modernity, Marx's newfangled men, as much the invention of modern time as machinery itself. Rimbaud's Il faut être absolument moderne, as the way through and beyond these contradictions. In the spirit of convergence, I have tried to read Marx as a modernist writer, to bring out the vividness and richness of his language, the depth and complexity of his imagery, clothes and nakedness, veils, halos, heat, cold, and to show how brilliantly he develops the themes by which modernism will come to define itself, the glory of modern energy and dynamism, the ravages of modern disintegration and nihilism, the strange intimacy between them, the sense of being caught in a vortex where all facts and values are whirled, exploded, decomposed, recombined. A basic uncertainty about what is basic, what is valuable, even what is real. A flaring up of the most radical hopes in the midst of their radical negations. At the same time, I have tried to read modernism in a Marxist way, to suggest how its characteristic energies, insights, and anxieties spring from the drives and strains of modern economic life, from its relentless and insatiable pressure for growth and progress, its expansion of human desires beyond local, national, and moral bounds, its demands on people to exploit not only their fellow men but also themselves, the volatility and endless metamorphosis of all its values in the maelstrom of the world market, its pitiless destruction of everything and everyone it cannot use, so much of the pre-modern world, but so much of itself and its own modern world as well, and its capacity to exploit crisis and chaos as a springboard for still more development, to feed itself on its own self-destruction. I don't pretend to be the first to bring Marxism and modernism together. In fact, they have come together on their own at several points over the past century, most dramatically at moments of historical crisis and revolutionary hope. We can see their fusion in Baudelaire, Wagner, Courbet, as well as Marx in 1948, in the Expressionists, Futurists, Dadaists, and Constructivists of 1914 to 25, in the ferment and agitation in Eastern Europe after Stalin's death, in the radical initiatives of the 1960s, from Prague and Paris and throughout the USA. But as revolutions have been suppressed or betrayed, radical fusion has given way to fission. Both Marxism and modernism have congealed into orthodoxies and gone their separate and mutually distrustful ways. So-called orthodox Marxists have at best ignored modernism, but all too often work to repress it out of fear, perhaps, that, in Nietzsche's phrase, if they kept looking into the abyss would start looking back into them. Orthodox modernists, meanwhile, have spared no expense of spirit in refashioning for themselves the halo of an unconditioned pure art, free from society and history. This essay tries to close off an exit route for orthodox Marxists by showing how the abyss they fear and flee opens up within Marxism itself. But Marxism's strength has always lain in its willingness to start from frightening social realities, to work through them and work them through. To abandon this primary source of strength leaves Marxism with little but the name. As for the orthodox modernists who avoid Marxist thought for fear that it might strip them of their halos, they need to learn that it could give them back something better in exchange, a heightened capacity to imagine and express the endlessly rich, complex, and ironic relationships between them and the modern bourgeois society that they try to deny or defy. A fusion of Marx with modernism should melt the too solid body of Marxism, or at least warm it up and thaw it out, and at the same time give modernist art and thought a new solidity and invest its creations with an unsuspected resonance and depth. It would reveal modernism as the realism of our time. I want in this concluding section to bring the ideas I have developed here to bear on some contemporary debates concerning Marx, modernism, and modernization. I will begin by considering the conservative indictments of modernism that developed at the end of the 1960s and that have flourished in the reactionary ambience of the past decade. According to Daniel Bell, the most serious of these polemicists, modernism has been the seducer, enticing contemporary men and women, and even children, to desert their moral, political, and economic stations and duties. Capitalism, for writers like Bell, is wholly innocent in this affair. It is portrayed as a kind of Charles Bovary, unexciting but decent and dutiful, working hard to fulfill his wayward wife's insatiable desires and to pay her insupportable debts. This portrait of capitalist innocence has a fine pastoral charm, But no capitalist could afford to take it seriously if he hoped to survive for even a week in the real world that capitalism has made. On the other hand, capitalists can certainly enjoy this picture as a fine piece of public relations and laugh all the way to the bank. Then, too, we must admire Bell's ingenuity in taking one of the most persistent of modernist orthodoxies, the autonomy of culture, the artist's superiority to all the norms and needs that bind the ordinary mortals around him, and turning it against modernism itself. But what is masked here, by modernists and anti-modernists alike, is the fact that these spiritual and cultural movements, for all their eruptive power, have been bubbles on the surface of a social and economic cauldron that has been teeming and boiling for more than 100 years. It is modern capitalism, not modern art and culture, that has set and kept the pot boiling, reluctant as capitalism may be to face the heat. The drug-crazed nihilism of William Burroughs, a favourite bête noire in anti-modernist polemics, is a pale reproduction of his ancestral trust, whose profits financed his avant-garde career. The Burroughs Adding Machine Company, now Burroughs International, sober nihilists of the bottom line. In addition to these polemical attacks, modernism has always elicited objections of a very different order. Marx in the Manifesto took up Goethe's idea of an emerging world literature and explained how modern bourgeois society was bringing a world culture into being. In place of the old wants, satisfied by the productions of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence. And as in material, so in spiritual production, the spiritual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible. And from the numerous national and local literatures there arises a world literature. Marx's scenario can serve as a perfect program for the international modernism that has flourished from his era to our own, a culture that is broad-minded and many-sided, that expresses the universal scope of modern desires, and that, despite the mediations of the bourgeois economy, is the common property of mankind. But what if this culture were not universal after all, as Marx thought it would be? What if it turned out to be an exclusively and parochially Western affair? This possibility was first proposed in the middle of the 19th century by various Russian populists. They argued that the explosive atmosphere of modernization in the West, the breakdown of communities and the psychic isolation of the individual, mass impoverishment and class polarization, the cultural creativity that sprang from desperate moral and spiritual anarchy, might be a cultural peculiarity rather than an iron necessity inexorably awaiting the whole of mankind. Why should not other nations and civilizations achieve more harmonious fusions of traditional ways of life with modern potentialities and needs? In short, sometimes this belief was expressed as a complacent dogma, sometimes as a desperate hope. It was only in the West that all that is solid melts into air. The 20th century has seen a great variety of attempts to realize 19th century populist dreams, as revolutionary regimes have come to power all over the underdeveloped world. These regimes have all tried in many different ways to achieve what 19th century Russians called the leap from feudalism to socialism. In other words, by heroic exertions, to attain the heights of modern community without ever going through the depths of modern fragmentation and disunity. This is no place to explore the many different modes of modernization that are available in the world today. But it is relevant to point out the fact that, in spite of the enormous differences among political systems today, so many seem to share a fervent desire to wipe modern culture off their respective maps. Their hope is that if only the people can be protected from this culture, then they can be mobilized in a solid front to pursue common national aims, instead of going off in a multitude of directions to pursue volatile and uncontrollable aims of their own. Now, it would be stupid to deny that modernization can proceed along a number of different roads. Indeed, the whole point of modernization theory is to chart these roads. There is no reason that every modern city must look and think like New York or Los Angeles or Tokyo. Nevertheless, we need to scrutinize the aims and interests of those who would protect their people from modernism for their own good. If this culture were really exclusively Western, and hence as irrelevant to the Third World as most of its governments say, would these governments need to expend as much energy repressing it as they do? What they are projecting onto aliens, and prohibiting as Western decadence, is in fact their own people's energies and desires and critical spirit. When government spokesmen and propagandists proclaim their various countries to be free of this alien influence, what they really mean is merely that they have managed to keep a political and spiritual lid on their people so far. When the lid comes off, or is blown off, the modernist spirit is one of the first things to come out. It is the return of the repressed. It is this spirit, at once lyrical and ironical, corrosive and committed, fantastic and realistic, that has made Latin American literature the most exciting in the world today, though it is also this spirit that forces Latin American writers to write from European or North American exile, on the run from their own censors and political police. It is this spirit that speaks from the dissident wall posters in Peking and Shanghai, proclaiming the rights of free individuality in a country that, so we are told only yesterday by China's Maoist mandarins and their comrades in the West, isn't even supposed to have a word for individuality. It is the culture of modernism that inspires the hauntingly intense electronic rock music of the plastic people of Prague, music that is played in thousands of barricaded rooms on bootleg cassettes even as the musicians languish in prison camps. It is modernist culture that keeps critical thought and free imagination alive in much of the non-Western world today. Governments don't like it, but it is likely that in the long run they can't help it. So long as they are forced to sink or swim in the maelstrom of the world market, forced to strive desperately to accumulate capital, forced to develop or disintegrate, or rather, as it generally turns out, to develop and disintegrate, so long as they are, as Octavio Paz says, condemned to modernity, they are bound to produce cultures that will show them what they are doing and what they are. Thus, as the Third World is increasingly caught up in the dynamics of modernization, modernism, far from exhausting itself, is only just beginning to come into its own. In closing, I want to comment briefly on two indictments of Marx by Herbert Marcuse and Hannah Arendt, which raise some of the central issues of this book. Marcuse and Arendt formulated their critiques in America in the 1950s, but seem to have conceived them in the 1920s, in the milieu of German romantic existentialism. In a sense, their arguments go back to the debates between Marx and the young Hegelians in the 1840s. Nevertheless, the issues they raise are as relevant as ever today. The basic premise is that Marx uncritically celebrates the values of labor and production, and neglects other human activities and modes of being that are ultimately at least as important. Marx is reproached here, in other words, for a failure of moral imagination. Marcuse's most trenchant criticism of Marx occurs in Eros and Civilization, in which Marx's presence is evident on every page, but strangely never mentioned by name. However, in a passage like the one that follows, where Marx's favorite culture hero, Prometheus, is attacked, it is obvious what is being said between the lines. Prometheus is the culture hero of toil, productivity, and progress through repression, the trickster and suffering rebel against the gods, who creates culture at the price of perpetual pain. He symbolizes productiveness, the unceasing effort to master life. Prometheus is the archetypal hero of the performance principle. Marcuse proceeds to nominate alternate mythological figures whom he considers more worthy of idealization: Orpheus, Narcissus, and Dionysus, and Baudelaire and Rilke, whom Marcuse sees as their modern votaries. They stand for a very different reality. Theirs is the image of joy and fulfillment, the voice that does not command but sings, the deed which is peace and ends the labor of conquest, the liberty from time that unites man with God, man with nature, the redemption of pleasure, the halt of time, the absorption of death, silence, sleep, night, paradise, the nirvana principle, not as death, but life. What the Promethean Marxian vision fails to see is the joys of peacefulness and passivity, sensual languor, mystical rapture, a state of oneness with nature, rather than achieve mastery over it. There is something to this. Certainly, luxe, calme et volupté is far from the center of Marx's imagination, but less than there may at first seem to be. If Marx is fetishistic about anything, it is not work and production, but rather the far more complex and comprehensive ideal of development, the free development of physical and spiritual energies, 1844 manuscripts, development of a totality of capacities in the individuals themselves, German ideology. The free development of each will be the condition for the free development of all, Manifesto. The universality of individual needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc., Grundrisse. The fully developed individual, Capital. The experiences and human qualities that Marcuse values would certainly be included in this agenda, though there is no guarantee that they would head the list. Marx wants to embrace Prometheus and Orpheus. He considers communism worth fighting for, because for the first time in history it would enable men to have both. He might also argue that it is only against a background of Promethean striving that Orphic rapture gains moral or psychic value. Lux, calme et volupté, by themselves, are merely boring, as Baudelaire knew well. Finally, it is valuable for Marcuse to proclaim, as the Frankfurt School has always proclaimed, the ideal of a harmony between man and nature. But it is equally important for us to realize that whatever the concrete content of this balance and harmony might be, a difficult enough question in its own right, it would take an immense amount of Promethean activity and striving to create it. Moreover, even if it could be created, it would still have to be maintained, and given the dynamism of the modern economy, mankind would have to work incessantly, like Sisyphus, but constantly striving to develop new measures and new means, to keep its precarious balance from being swept away and melting in foul air. Arendt, in The Human Condition, understands something that liberal critics of Marx generally miss. The real problem, in his thought, is not a draconic authoritarianism, but its radical opposite, the lack of a basis for any authority at all. Marx predicted correctly, though with an unjustified glee, the withering away of the public realm under the conditions of the unhampered development of the productive forces of society. The members of his communist society would find themselves, ironically, caught in the fulfillment of needs that nobody can share and which nobody can fully communicate. Arendt understands the depth of the individualism that underlies Marx's communism, and understands, too, the nihilistic directions in which that individualism may lead. In a communist society where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, what is going to hold these freely developing individuals together? They might share a common quest for infinite experiential wealth, but this would be no true public realm, but only private activities displayed in the open. A society like this might well come to feel a sense of collective futility, the futility of a life which does not fix or realize itself in any permanent subject that endures after its labor is past. This critique of Marx poses an authentic and urgent human problem, but Arendt comes no closer than Marx to resolving the problem. Here, as in many of her works, she weaves a splendid rhetoric of public life and action, but leaves it quite unclear what this life and action are supposed to consist of, except that political life is not supposed to include what people do all day, their work and production relationships. These are consigned to the cares of the household, a sub-political realm which Arendt considers to be devoid of the capacity to create human value. Arendt never makes it clear what, besides lofty rhetoric, modern men can or ought to share. She is right to say that Marx never developed a theory of political community, and right that this is a serious problem. But the problem is that, given the nihilistic thrust of modern personal and social development, it is not at all clear what political bonds modern men can create. Thus, the trouble in Marx's thought turns out to be a trouble that runs through the whole structure of modern life itself. I have been arguing that those of us who are most critical of modern life need modernism most, to show us where we are and where we can begin to change our circumstances and ourselves. In search of a place to begin, I have gone back to one of the first and greatest of modernists, Karl Marx. I have gone to him not so much for his answers as for his questions. The great gift he can give us today, it seems to me, is not a way out of the contradictions of modern life, but a surer and deeper way into these contradictions. He knew that the way beyond the contradictions would have to lead through modernity, not out of it. He knew we must start where we are, psychically naked, stripped of all religious, aesthetic, moral halos and sentimental veils, thrown back on our individual will and energy, forced to exploit each other and ourselves in order to survive. And yet, in spite of all, thrown together by the same forces that pull us apart, dimly aware of all we might be together, ready to stretch ourselves to grasp new human possibilities, to develop identities and mutual bonds that can help us hold together as the fierce modern air blows hot and cold through us all.